Hello, I'm Brendan Begellan with the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, and welcome to our open house #1, the virtual edition for the Upper Welland Tributaries Floodplain Mapping Project. We're going to have 3 presenters today. Myself, Brendan Begellan, I'm the project manager with NPCA. Rob Amos is the project manager with our consulting engineer, Act4 Beach, and David Deluce, the director of planning and development with NPCA. So to start off, this is our the study area for the Upper Welland Tributaries floodplain mapping project. It's quite a large area. There are 19 creeks or tributaries that flow into the Welland River that we're mapping. You can see inside here, this middle part, that is the Welland River proper. It already has floodplain mapping. We did that back in about 2016, and we're not going to redo that project. So that is excluded from this. What we're looking at are these colored areas that are flowing into it. There are 10 named creeks that are in green, and then there are 9 additional kind of smaller tributaries or creeks highlighted in yellow that we don't have names for, which incidentally, if anybody knows of any local names or names for these tributaries, would be interested to hear them. But so we're going to be mapping all of these areas. Only Buckhorn Creek here in the northwest has some existing mapping, but it's fairly old and limited, so we're going to redo that. And all of these other areas have no mapping that we know of. So the question is, why are we doing this mapping? Well, NPCA is mandated by the provincial government to regulate development activities within hazardous areas, including within floodplains. And this reduces flooding risk to health and safety and property damage. If we can limit development within flood-prone areas, then we're reducing health and safety risk for floods and also damage to our buildings and property. This is an example of a floodplain map. We overlay on a map of the area. We overlay the area that we think is flood prone. We do an engineering assessment and determine these areas that are at risk of flooding. So this is, as we say, the first step to reducing cost and improving safety. So in an undeveloped area, if we can identify which zones are susceptible to flooding and avoid developing in those areas, then we've eliminated the risk of flooding in those areas. In developed areas, if we can identify the flooding potential, then we can respond to flooding. We can know, for example, this road looks like it is likely to overtop in a major flood event, and so we can plan evacuation routes and response routes. We can also plan on how to protect property that's vulnerable to flooding. So the next question is, how big of a flood should we model and map? The provincial government has established a regulatory flood. So the size of the flood they've called the regulatory flood in all areas of the province. For this project, in most of NPCA's jurisdiction, it's what they call the 1 in 100-year flood. It can be a little bit confusing. It's because flooding is not a cyclical thing. It's not the flood that happens every 100 years. It's a flood that has a 1 in 100 chance, or a 1% chance of happening every single year. So if we had the 100-year flood last year, there's still a 1% chance of having the same flood next year. If we haven't had it for 100 years, there's still a 1% chance of having the 1 in 100-year flood next year. Now for this project, we are also mapping some larger floods. The 1 in 200-year flood, or a 0.5% chance of occurring every year, and the 1 in 300-year flood, which is about a 0.3% chance of happening every year. And these floods will serve as a bit of a proxy for climate change, because with climate change, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but there is some evidence suggesting that floods may become larger and more frequent in the future. So we want to get at a sense of how resilient our watersheds are to these larger floods. Here's an example of that. You can see if, for example, the 1 in 100-year flood was down here on this yellow line, then the 1 in 200-year could be slightly larger in the blue shaded area, and the 350-year flood could be the large red area. And so by mapping this, we can understand how resilient our floodplain is. In this downstream area, downstream of Weber Road here, you can see the three lines are almost on top of each other. So going from the 100-year flood to the 200-year all the way up to the 350-year has very little impact on the flooded area. So I would say that area is very resilient to the potential changes of impacts of climate change. In the upstream area, however, the yellow lines is the 100-year, and then the 200-year steps out to this light blue area. It's a fairly significant increase, and then there's a much larger increase again up to the 350-year flood line. This area is much more susceptible to potential impacts of climate changes. Larger floods just flood larger areas. And that's good to know for planning and understanding our flood risk. It's important to note, though, that we regulate to the 100-year flood line only. The 200-year and the 350-year flood line are good to know for planning, for recommendations, but they're not regulatory lines. Then there's the question of how we do the floodplain mapping. The provincial government has developed a very comprehensive technical guide to outline best practices on how we do floodplain mapping. This is used by all conservation authorities across the province to standardize the approach, and our consultants like Aquifer Beach understand this technical guide very well, and that just standardizes so that we know all floodplain maps across the province are done in the same way, to the same standards. So there's consistency across the entire province. Here's the general project schedule and outline for how we do these floodplain mapping projects. We are right here at the beginning, just after project initiation at our first open house. The first step in the modeling in the project is to do some field surveys and hydrologic modeling, after which we'll have another open house to meet with you again. That's tentatively scheduled for about February, probably. The consultants will then do all of their modeling and come up with draft mapping that we'll present at our third open house, now scheduled for June. And at that time, we invite you back in to see exactly what mapping we have and see if it jives with your understanding of flooding in your area. You can see what the potential impacts are on your properties and give us feedback there. Provided there isn't any significant changes, that any new, significant new information that we learned there, we'll go into a 30-day comment period, after which we can finalize and adopt the mapping for regulatory purposes. And then the point of these open houses is that we want to hear from you. We want to hear what your experiences are on the watersheds, what types of floods you've seen, how big are they, where does it flood, where has it never flooded? And so you can get in touch with us in many ways. One is through these open houses. You can come in person to our in-person open houses. And we also have this Get Involved portal on the web. This is what it looks like here. There's this long link to our Get Involved site, and this QR code should bring you right to the Get Involved page. There we post all of the project materials. There's a question and answer you can submit directly through the site, or you can email us directly. The emails there will come right to me, and we can answer your questions directly. So we'd love to hear from you on your experiences on this in these floodplains, in these watersheds. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it over to Rob Amos with Aquifer Beach to tell you a little more about how they're going to go about this modeling. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. So just a quick walkthrough in terms of some of the key steps of building out the floodplain mapping. So the first step that Aquifer will do is compile the base mapping, which will form the foundation for those floodplain maps. An example of base mapping is on the right-hand side, and what that includes are property lines, road networks, houses, and other key elements that we'll find throughout the study area. With an understanding of what the overview mapping looks like throughout the study area with the water courses and how they drain from the top end through to the bottom towards that Welland River, we'll update and augment that base mapping with detailed topographic surveys. Particularly for floodplain mapping projects, we do topographic survey of all of the different bridges and culverts at road crossings throughout the study area, as those are key elements that look to provide control and can impact conveyance, particularly under flood flows. With that understanding of the existing conditions accurately detailed within our mapping, we then build out a hydrologic model to define what those flood flow return periods are, and specifically what the volume of flow will be at all the different key locations throughout the study area. With that information, an understanding of flows and existing conditions, that will all feed into a HEC-RAS hydraulic model that will then be used to define the limits of that 1 to 100 year flood hazard event. With all of that information having been compiled and presented for your review, Alcafor will work with the MPCA to define the floodplain maps, which will define those limits of flood hazard throughout the study area. Next slide, please, Brendan. This is an example of what an end result floodplain mapping product will look like. You can see that it has the extents as noted for the 1 to 100 year floodlines and how those are centered over top of the water courses. It also illustrates the local road crossings with an aerial image in the background to provide context in terms of where the property buildings, structures, and other key aspects are located within the study areas. They're plotted at a scale which is visible so that one can understand specifically how the flood hazard event relates to their property or area of interest. This here is an example of a previous flood hazard map that was completed by Alcafor for NPCA within the Coyle and Draper Creek watershed. Next slide, please, Brenda. Just a little bit about Alcafor. We are a Canadian engineering consulting firm who has been providing similar services such as this since 1990. We specialize in building hydrologic and hydraulic models, along with undertaking topographic surveys, specifically with interest in undertaking projects such as this. Some of the other works that we do, we develop stormwater management master plans for municipalities as well as conservation authorities. We undertake watershed planning, and we do natural channel design as well as design of structures for water course crossings such as bridges and culverts. So we're very well suited to undertaking these types of studies and have a significant amount of experience in defining flood hazard limits. With that, I'll pass it over to David.
Thanks, Rob. So we've talked about how we develop floodplain mapping. We talked about why we do floodplain mapping in the first place. But one of the questions that remains is what happens if you find that your property has floodplain on it? So what does the Conservation Authority's policies say you can or cannot do? Next slide, please. So just some context about where we get our legal jurisdiction for regulating a floodplain. So the first section comes from the Conservation Authorities Act, specifically Section 28, which was updated back in April of 2024. And also in conjunction with that is our regulation, Ontario Regulation 4124. So that particular regulation applies to all conservation authorities across Ontario. So before April 1st, 2024, each conservation authority had its own regulation, which set out specific standards for that jurisdiction. Now all conservation authorities across the province are subject to one regulation, which provides more consistency and better insurance that if you go through a permit with one conservation authority, you should expect relatively the same process with another one. The third piece of legislation that we follow is the Planning Act, specifically Section 3, the Provincial Planning Statement, and that comes into effect primarily when we're dealing with a planning application review. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. Our policy document, which was approved in 2022 and updated in 2024 to conform with the changes made to the legislation, our policy document serves as our guide for decision making. So if you apply for a permit with the NPCA and you're wondering what our policies are, what our position would be, depending on what you're proposing with your application, that's where our policies come into effect. So it's to ensure that there is consistent decision making when we're reviewing permit applications. Next slide, please. So when we're dealing with a floodplain, what types of uses or activities are allowed? So first of all, we allow for passive open space uses. So if there was a park with minimal structures, maybe playground equipment, but no buildings or anything bigger than that, but just open space. Accessory uses, so sheds, stuff like that, subject to criteria. There's some details about what size limits are and maybe some floodproofing requirements. Additions to existing buildings that are within the floodplain, so up to 500 square feet. New agricultural buildings, again, subject to criteria about making sure there's no negative impact to other uses or other properties along the floodplain. Up to 50 cubic meters of clean fill. Fill beyond that may be allowed, but then you're getting into having to do hydraulic modeling or other types of engineering studies to demonstrate that there's going to be no negative impact. Balanced cut and fill. So what that is if you find that your property has floodplain covering a certain area and you wish to try and, I'll say, adjust where that floodplain is, you may be able to go through the exercise of doing a balanced cut and fill. So you would fill in one area of the floodplain to take it out of the floodplain, but you would make a corresponding cut or introduce floodplain on a different location where there wasn't previously any floodplain. It's an engineering exercise and it's not always available for every property. It depends on the characteristics of the floodplain within that property, but that's something we could talk about. If somebody's looking to try and do that, they could talk to our staff first, find out what's involved in that and find out if that is a feasible option. We have a catch-all, which is basically any other use that's likely not to incur flood damage from floodwaters. So because we can't really anticipate every foreseeable example of what somebody might propose, we do have a catch-all policy that would allow for uses to be entertained that aren't explicitly listed in our policy document. And finally, there's also a new section as a result of the changes last year to our regulation, which includes exemptions, and those are in Section 5 of Regulation 4124. Next slide, please. Now, on the other side, what is not allowed? So, and just I'll caveat this by saying that these uses, these policies are actually taken from the provincial policy statement. So this is something that's handed to us by the province. So first, sensitive uses such as hospitals, nursing homes, daycares, any type of institutional use generally. We don't want those in floodplains because, for example, hospitals or nursing homes, if there was ever an event of a flood and it had to be evacuated, it's very challenging to evacuate those types of uses or those facilities quickly. So we want to try and make sure that they aren't located in an area where they would be subject to increased risk. Emergency services facilities, again, same reason, you don't want to subject those facilities to any additional risk. So a fire station, for example, you wouldn't want to have that located in a floodplain if it had to respond to an emergency during that kind of situation. Uses associated with the disposal, treatment, manufacturing, or storage of hazardous substances. Again, just for I think the obvious reason of wanting to not have any polluting type materials exposed to a floodplain. And then we have kind of similar catch-all of uses or development activities that are not fit, that do not fit within a permitted use and are deemed to be inappropriate based on the objectives within our policy. So ensuring that there's no negative impact to the floodplain, ensuring that there's no potential damage to people and property, anything that is of too high of a risk, that would fall under that policy there, and we would not be able to support that within a floodplain. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about floodplains, we also need to talk about another type of flood hazard that's associated with floodplains. It's called a spill area. And what those are is they are areas, technically they're not part of the floodplain. If you could envision the floodplain as being like a long channel or a bigger version of the channel of a watercourse, spill areas are spots where the floodplain might actually exit that channel or that corridor and spill out to the surrounding areas. They typically are a little bit more challenging to define the extent of flooding. You can model it, but it's a little more expensive and a little more involved to do that modeling. I'll leave that for the engineers to explain. But we treat that differently from a policy perspective. So because it's a little bit less defined, and typically it's, I'll say, a little less risk involved, there's slower velocities involved. We do, our policies are a little more permissive for those situations. We typically look at making sure that there is safe access to whatever use is going on, and also making sure that appropriate flood proofing is implemented. There are still situations where if a use is proposed in a spill area and it could have a negative impact to an adjoining property or another use, because it could cause flooding there that wasn't previously there, that is something that may cause us to have to say no to a permit application in that case. Next slide, please. So our role in planning applications. So when we talk about a Planning Act application, we're talking about zoning amendments or subdivisions or consents or minor variances. So the Conservation Authority is mandated by the province to ensure that such Planning Act applications are consistent with the natural hazard policies of the provincial planning statement. So right now that's section 5 of the provincial planning statement. And we provide those comments directly to the municipality who is doing the application. So we're ensuring that there's conformity with the PPS, as we call it. We're also ensuring that if there was a permit required following those planning applications, that there won't be any conflict, so that we're not in a situation where a planning application gets approved that requires a permit from us in which we could not support the permit. So we try to work through those ahead of receiving a permit application to make sure that there's not going to be any conflicts. And then as part of that role as well, on occasion, the Conservation Authority may actually have to file appeals to the Ontario Land Tribunal if there's a situation where there's non-conformity with or non-consistency with the policies of the provincial planning statement, and there needs to be an appeal lodged. So the Conservation Authority could find itself in that situation. So this concludes our presentation. We thank you for your attention. Please note the QR code you see there, that takes us to the project portal page on our website. So we encourage you to check there frequently. There will be updates. The presentation will be there, as well as other resource materials. Also, if you have questions, there is a Q&A section there that you can post your questions. We will reply to them. Also, contacts for this project are posted there. So if you have a specific question or you want to engage with them through conversation, you can reach out through email through those contacts. So again, thank you for your time.